Okay, so chapter 2, setting your goals. I think this is an important chapter, obviously, to have early in the book because before you're approaching any situation with someone where there's some kind of a difference of opinion, you've got to decide beforehand, well, what exactly do I envision happening at the outcome of this, conversation? So, in some cases, you're not going to necessarily change someone's opinion if they're very much clinging to their point of view, but you might at least change the mood around the subject. Politics and religion, of course, like the two topics that you really don't want to get into that deeply and think that you're going to quote unquote win because people really hold tight to their beliefs. So you might just think, I'm not going to change this person's mind, but I might at least change the mood around this topic. Maybe we can at least, it could be a topic that we could discuss without necessarily trying to change the other person. Whereas in some cases, there might be some people where you disagree so strongly that you can't even change, the mood or the attitude around the subject. So, mood, mind, and action, these go back to the ancient Greek philosopher Cicero's description of how to look at argument. So, mood is like the first level. You can change the mood sometimes with, sense of humor. A joke often lightens the mood. Other things can change the mood. It could be having some music on. It could be having, the aroma of some fresh baked bread. It could be the mood that you're in when you enter the conversation, and that mood, that your temperament could influence their temperament. If you're very easygoing and relaxed, that might put them at ease. If you're tense and uncomfortable, they might pick up on that, which could make them tense and uncomfortable. So mood is that kind of somewhat difficult to necessarily control or pinpoint, but nevertheless an important part of when you enter into a discussion. Mood could also just be the time of day. People in the morning, for instance, tend to be a lot more chipper and awake and thinking more clearly, not so tired unless they've been up all night for something. So if somebody is not sick, they've gotten good rest, mornings tend to be a good time to deal with, as long as it's not too early. Tackle things that might be more difficult to think about, complex issues. Whereas, end of the day, people are tired. They say that, judges in a courtroom tend to give much harsher sentences later in the day versus earlier in the day just because of the mood they're in. So timing is important, and that's part of that amorphous sort of category of mood. Mind just refers to logic. When Cicero is saying, is your goal to change the mind of someone? Well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So there's that saying, which just means, you can lay out all these facts of why you want to do something, or why somebody should lend you money, or why you should go on this trip to Australia, or why you're ready to change jobs. But they can all be valid, and that is an important part of argument. It's good to have your reasons thought out and your supporting evidence relevant to your reasons and all of that wonderful stuff. And yet, it's not necessarily going to change somebody's mind. It might get them to think about it differently. It might make them a little more receptive. Versus, if you present a bunch of facts that are not well cited, we don't understand where your sources came from, the organization of your ideas is really hard to follow, of course, that is not going to look as good. And if someone were listening to your argument for why they should lend you money, but, the way that you present the reasons, it becomes really hard to follow what you're saying, and you seem like you're not really necessarily a trustworthy person, well, then that's going to not help you, right? So logos, logic is an important part of persuasion, but it's not the only part, and it's not necessarily going to convince someone, but it will either help your case, help you seem more credible, or it can take away some of your credibility if you don't have it. But it is part of, the three ways of looking at argument. And the third aspect, action, Cicero is saying, well, you might be entering a situation with someone where you're not only trying to change the mood, you're not only trying to get them to think about this topic that you're presenting to them in a different way by providing different facts and evidence, but you actually want them to do something differently or believe something different. And this is probably the hardest part of any kind of conversation or argument. You're actually trying to change something about the other person. And, people don't like to change. They don't like to necessarily change what they're doing or what they believe. So as long as you understand that it's very hard normally to change what people think or do. As long as you're open to that and willing to acknowledge that, they could have their own agenda. They could be trying to change you of what you're doing and what you're thinking. And so one of the main purposes of this book is to help you understand the many, many different tools you have at your disposal to try to change the way somebody thinks or feels or what they do. But also acknowledging that this is not easy. It's very complicated. And sometimes, you may not be able to change what somebody is thinking or doing, but maybe in terms of the goals of a conversation, even if you can't change what they're doing now, you can't change what they're feeling or thinking now, you could at least make them more receptive, possibly, to a future conversation. So, for instance, I use parenting a lot as an example, but, I might not be able to get my kids to eat more vegetables now, right? I remember when they were growing up, it was like, eat more broccoli, eat more peas. No, I only want to eat macaroni and cheese all the time, right? But over time, having sort of, repeated that phrase so many times and tried to be an example myself by eating more salad and all of that, after many years of emphasizing the importance, and at the same time, obviously, I'm not going to force feed them things. But they picked up on it. They actually picked up on it, and now it's part of their lives. They know that it's important, and maybe they still don't eat exactly the way I think they should. But it's an important value. It took a long time to get there. And that's what I mean by it's really hard to force anyone to do something differently or think something differently. But you can be an example. You can, play the long game and give it time. And over time, the other person might begin to see why it might be good to change, their particular tactic or approach. So mood, mind, and action, all very important. Different ways of looking at argument, different ways of deciding ahead of time, what is my realistic goal here? And if you can stay realistic about that, that ultimately will put less pressure on people. And when people feel less pressure, they tend to be more open and receptive to thinking or looking at things differently.